Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our Johnson County K-State Extension Evening Horticulture class. Tonight, we're very pleased to have with us one of our favorite speakers that we have here on and off at Extension, and that is one of our Extension Master Gardener volunteers from the Meridicine or Paola area, Lenora Larson. Lenora is a popular speaker on a wide range of topics here in the Kansas City area. Her background is a microbiologist, but she also is an avid gardener. As some people have said in the chat box, if you want to learn more about Lenora, she is the feature article in the current issue of Garden Gate magazine. Lenora, in my estimation, is a trendsetter. She adopted the idea of natives and some of what I'm going to call these newer pollinator-friendly habitat gardening trends or processes long before they became trendy. And in fact, I know there's an Arboretum Botanical Garden in Kansas that changed their philosophy based on Lenora's philosophy. So without any further ado, I am going to turn it over to Lenora Larson, Extension Master Gardener from Meridicine, an excellent gardener resource in the Kansas City area, to talk about using natives in the ornamental garden.
Thank you, Dennis. Hi, everybody. So this is one of the times when I really wish we were in person, because I like to get audience participation. And I really wish I could know how many of you have already started adding native plants to your ornamental garden. So I'm forced to guess, maybe about 50% of you. So you already know that you've been lied to. Natives are not necessarily the next thing to slice bread. They have all of the same virtues and flaws of what we call ornamental plants. And so you are not guaranteed success. Dennis, let me try one more. It's not going forward anymore.
Put your cursor on the slide and click on it, and then try that.
Nope. This is one of the things, people, that we tested before you all came on. Let me try hitting all my buttons.
There you go. It's going.
There we go. Okay. So we have a lot to talk about. We're going to start with definitions. The USDA is very clear on what is a native plant. Some of you still want to argue about it. And then why plant natives? Because it's going to seem to you that I say a lot of really rude things about them. And yet I would say in my garden, about 70% of the biomass is native. We're going to talk about ornamental garden design and how that is applied to native plants. And then the big sticking issue for almost every gardener is maintenance. That happens to be my favorite part of gardening, but this is proof that I was toilet trained far too early and have too great attention to detail. And then we're going to have some resources and summary. Before I change this slide, I do want to talk about the plant that is in the very front. Again, if we were in person, I could ask, does anybody recognize this beauty? Because most of you have probably seen it in your yard, especially if you have full sun, and you have rudely ripped it out of the earth. That is goatweed. It is a native prairie plant. It is also the only plant that the caterpillar of the absolutely glorious large orange goatweed leafwing butterfly can eat. And so, of course, I welcome it in my garden, and by treating it as though it is an ornamental plant, it looks like an ornamental plant. So, definitions. The USDA, that's the United States Department of Agriculture, has chosen what we could say is an arbitrary definition for what is native, whether you're a plant or an animal, and that's whether or not you were present before the Europeans arrived at a location. And so for the United States, 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and that's when we say, if you were here when Columbus set foot on the United States, on America, then you are a native. And then you can drill it down even further which a lot of us prefer to do. So for Kansas, the date given is 1855, when Kansas settlers first came. They were the first Europeans, primarily German settlers. And so any plant that was here when they arrived would be deemed a native. Pretty clear, actually. But we recognize it is artificial. It has nothing to do with the botany or biology of the plants. It is the timeline. Where we get into trouble are the naturalized plants, because some of those plants were brought here so early. And believe it or not, plants like dandelions and crabgrass, Johnson grass, henbit, all of these were brought to the United States by Europeans on purpose, because they wanted plants that were familiar from their homeland. And they also had usually medicinal purposes for those plants. So even though dandelions have been here over 400 years, they can never be called native, because they were not here when Columbus arrived. And then, of course, ornamentals. That's easy. These are the plants that have been selected and cultivated and planted and cared for by humans. Now, there are people who are so extreme that any plant that appears in their yard that did not arrive in a plastic pot with a little sticker on it is deemed a weed and thrown out. Now, I draw a very large umbrella for my garden. And if I see any strange plant, unless I recognize it, and I do have the advantages, I always admit my advantages. My father was a botanist with his master's from Harvard. And so he began to train me as a botanist when I was about 12. And so I learned the botanical names first and loved them. They are so beautiful. So when I see a plant, I usually have at least some notion of who it might be. And most of the time I will leave it the first time it shows up to see, do we have another welcome guest at my party? So I actually learned this term, nativar, from Dennis. Yes, I had never heard it before you, Dennis, and I love it and have immediately adopted it, the nativars. And so here we get again into some pretty sticky ground where a lot of people disagree. And so I'm going to say, as an example, Echinacea Papuria, which is our purple coneflower. And there are actually about 10 species of Echinacea. So they can be crossed both naturally and by man, and form all these different hybrids. And then the plant itself, which is the case with our Cheyenne spirit, the plants themselves can alter mutations and responses to environment. And so Cheyenne spirit is a natural variety. It's not a hybrid. It's certainly not GMO. And back in the old days, now get ready for this because this is shocking. Nurseries used to start plants from seed. Yes. Now almost everything you buy is either tissue culture or propagated from cuttings. But in the olden days, they started plants from seeds. And so they'd seeded out, a couple thousand pots of Echinacea Papuria, and the plantsman noticed that one of these pots, the flowers were not purple, they were sort of a sunset color. And so he snatched that plant up and began propagating it from seed to be sure that it was a stable variant and that it would come true from seed, and then introduced it to the market. And it's been around for many years. But, it wasn't created in the lab. It is a naturally occurring variety. So is this a native plant? Now, I consider this a matter of opinion. And I, of course, want to claim as many plants as natives as possible, just because that's the way I am. If you choose differently, that is your prerogative because it's your garden. And well, I think that sums it up. It's your garden and you get to make these decisions. Now we need some more definitions. Habitat. And habitat is where animals and plants naturally live. And so in Kansas, here in eastern Kansas, most of the habitat before the white man got here was this glorious tall grass prairie. Do you know that we have far more trees now than we did when the settlers first arrived? I mean, we've lost our tall grass prairie for many reasons. The interesting thing is most of the plants, native plants that you find in nurseries, they are perennials from the tall grass prairie. And so if you look at this, one of the things you noticed, first of all, it's not a garden because there's no organization at all to the plants, no design. But the other thing is how densely it's planted. So in your garden, you probably have one plant per square foot, or if they're big plants, one plant per square yard. In a prairie, naturally occurring, there are at least 25 to 50 different species of plants, all crammed into that 1 foot. And so there is this incredible competition for resources, water, sunlight, root space. And so automatically, when you take this plant from a prairie, of course, you've grown it in the pot, which is very unnatural. And then we buy it and take it home in a pot and put it in our gardens where we space it, we feed it, we water it. There's no way we have recreated the natural habitat of that native plant. And so to expect it to act like it does in the prairie, where they're, maybe 18 inches tall, and you put it in your garden and it shoots up to 5 feet because it no longer has to compete. Things to keep in mind when you're thinking about natives. Now, of course, gardens. Well, I mean, this is intuitive for us who are master gardeners. Gardens are highly manipulated, highly unnatural plots of ground where we humans are attempting to bend Mother Nature to our will. And she is fighting back at every moment. And so a garden takes, unless you use my techniques, I would say, a garden takes a tremendous amount of work to maintain it in this unnatural state. So if you look at just comparing gardens and habitat and looking at all the different elements of what makes up a plant's environment, whether it's a garden or a habitat, you see how different gardens are from habitat where the plants came from. So again, to expect that natives are going to behave in that very controlled, neat and tidy look that you can see out in a prairie, not going to happen because they're not in a prairie environment. So native plant myths, you've probably heard them all. I've already labeled them as myths. Okay, so first of all, that natives require less water, that they require less insecticides, that they take less maintenance. I'm almost laughing in your face at that. And then finally, that they are more nutritious for animals, especially insects, than the ornamental plants. Is this true? Sometimes. To quote my hero, Dennis, you are my hero. It depends. It depends entirely on the plant and on the surroundings that you put it in. So even for natives, we have to remember our master gardener mantra: right plant, right place, right place, right plant. Plants know what they need. And just because you want them to act differently or need different requirements, they are not going to change. You cannot put a sun-loving plant in the shade and expect it to thrive. And for all the natives, you cannot expect them to be happy if you do not put them in a place that recreates as closely as possible to their native habitat. So here's Echinacea Papuria, our purple coneflower. Actually, it's probably not native to Kansas. There's only one report of finding it in a native spot over in a southeastern corner of Kansas. We suspect, and it was in the 1800s that this plant was reported as a native in that corner of Kansas. We suspect that the botanist perhaps had lost his compass because no other sightings of native Echinacea Papuria have been found. Does that matter? Well, to some people it does. Some people are so fanatic about this idea of native, and if you aren't native, you should be sent back. They even want to send back honeybees. if you can imagine. And honeybees are not native. They were brought here in 1622, and they are actually a domesticated animal and have escaped. It's sort of like horses are a domesticated animal, but we also have feral horses. It's the same with honeybees. So for our Echinacea Papuria, they are not a prairie plant. They are a glade plant. They grew at the edges of forests, and while they like well-drained soil, they definitely like more moisture than our prairie plants. And when you say less water, well, there you're thinking about those prairie plants, because Kansas has wetlands. Kansas has a lot of plants that require water, and a lot of it. Did you know we even have an aquatic milkweed? But this, of course, is the swamp milkweed. And I was lucky enough when I moved to my property, this is my lake, I already had swamp milkweeds growing all around the lake because it is a native, but certainly not a native of our prairies. Less insecticides. Well, that's really interesting, because one of the reasons that nurseries and gardeners love ornamental plants is because they have less insects. Native plants have more insects. Native plants and our native insects evolved together. The difference is a lot of us who like native plants, we also like insects. So we have more insects on native plants. We just don't spray them. We learn to love them. So here is really some interesting research. I think people just automatically assumed that the species plants, because they evolved with the pollinators, would have more nutritional value for the pollinators. And that is turning out not to be true. Now, sometimes it is. It's just, you can't just make these broad statements. And so this, for instance, is Penstemon Digitalis, which is, of course, a native, and they're calling it wild type. This is research that was done at the Mount Cuba Center in Delaware. And so then they also looked at 3 of the cultivars. They looked at Blackbeard, Husker Red, and Pocahontas. Blackbeard and Husker Red attracted almost no pollinators. These are the 2 cultivars that we like because they're the most burgundy colored. In fact, Blackbeard's foliage is almost black. But it's a loser when it comes to pollinators. On the other hand, Pocahontas, another cultivar, is maybe even a little better than the species. So you can't make that blanket statement. Here's one even more dramatic. Now, Phlox Paniculata is our native species of phlox. I have it in my garden. I love it. So do my pollinators. But they looked at the species and then 6 other cultivars of phlox. And Gina, which I happen to have, I bought it 10 years ago, but not because I knew it was better for pollinators, but because it's the most floriferous of the phlox. And it turns out pollinators feel the same way. This cultivar is 7 times more attractive to pollinators, 7 times more attractive to pollinators than the species. It doesn't relate to the nectar. I always thought nectar quality is, in fact, I got to change some slides now based on this research. I thought it was nectar quality that made the flowers the most attractive. But it turns out with this phlox, the genus corolla, or opening to the nectaries, is the smallest. And the pollinators like that better. Who knew? So this is kind of a difficulty for all of us when we're out shopping. How do you know whether or not, because it's hard to find the species. And I've heard you all complaining at nurseries, and I've heard you complaining at our plant sale, is most of the nurseries do not sell the species unless they are a strictly native plant nursery. Most of them are selling nativars. Which nativars are going to be better for pollinators and which aren't? Well, there is starting to be research. You can Google a particular species and see what the status is and if it's been studied. The Chicago Botanical Gardens in Illinois and Mount Cuba in Delaware are 2 of the facilities I'm aware of that are doing the most research. But you end up doing a lot of just research We call it the citizen scientist in your own yard. You try, and does it attract pollinators? And for many of us, if it doesn't, we rip it out. It becomes compost. So the claim of less maintenance, that automatically, if you're a native, you require less maintenance than ornamentals. Well, if we were having a duel or a card game, I could match you plant by plant. Every native that doesn't need much maintenance, I could slap down an ornamental that doesn't need much maintenance. I defy anybody to show me a plant better than, for instance, the Russian sage, the Perovskia, or sedums, or agastaki. I mean, these are all plants these are perennials. And once they're in the ground, they come up every year. I have some of these plants that are over 40 years old that faithfully return every single year and require no grooming and no watering and no fertilizing. Sounds like almost no maintenance plant to me. And these are ornamentals. When you think of the nursery industry, they have spent literally billions of dollars improving plants. Now, sometimes these improvements, some of these hybrids, they're sterile. And if you care about pollinators, that's a problem. If you're only into aesthetics, then the plants are improved. What they're looking for is what we humans value, which is dwarf plants with giant flowers. I call them Frankenflowers. But some of those Frankenflowers have tremendous amount of nectar and bloom for months. So you just can't automatically say that this ornamental, that's a hybrid, is inferior to these natives. Many of the natives are extremely high maintenance. You see my picture, common milkweed. I don't recommend common milkweed to any beginning gardener, because you've got to have a whole bunch of strategies in your toolkit to control this monster and keep it from taking over your property. I've got a list here. I went to one of Alan Branhagen's, those of you who remember him, director of horticulture out at Powell Gardens, and he did a talk on, well, see, we're not supposed to call native plants invasive because this is their home. We call them aggressive. So he had a list of aggressive native plants. I'm so proud to say I had every single one of them in my garden. I just love aggressive native plants because I hate the plant. And so any plant that will take control of its own reproductive skills, I'm all with it. I would much rather groom, weed, and trim than plant. But every garden is different. Some of you will hate these thugs, and others, like me, we embrace them. I have every plant that's on this list. So we're still left with aesthetic problems with native plants because they bloom primarily in spring and fall. And I don't know about your garden, but my garden is full of pollinators in the summer. And their foliage is usually very boring. And then they're kind of long and lanky. And what's turning out to be one of the biggest issues for our native plants is HOAs and cities and counties who forbid weeds and have very severe regulations. And some of them are really pretty fierce about defending lawns versus plantings. So why plant native plants? I've already, I think, proven to you that they are not automatically superior. But here is the truth. You go for the individual plant that you love, whether it is a native or an ornamental. So here's that native Phlox Paniculata. In fact, in my garden, that Jenna, which is 7 times more effective for pollinators, is just to the left of this garden. But many of our native plants are very beautiful. Now, what you sacrifice is this is the only color that Phlox Paniculata comes in. If you want other colors or a different growth habit, then you are going to have to go to a cultivar or a nativar. And it's true that if you plant a nativar in the right place, now this is not in a garden, and this is Echinacea Palada, and this is the true native coneflower for eastern Kansas. In western Kansas, it's Echinacea angustifolia. But here we have Echinacea Palada, I think extremely beautiful. They grow up and down my road, Plum Creek Road, because my property used to be a tall grass prairie. The problem is I can't grow these in my garden. because I water too much. And they are toast if their feet get wet and stay wet, especially in the winter. For many of us, and this is part of my motivation for having native plants, is a sense of place. I want my land to be in Kansas. I want the plants to look like they're in Kansas. I want all of the rocks to be from Kansas. I want to recreate that special place that Kansas is. I moved here from Michigan, so I probably love Kansas more than those of you who are natives because I really appreciate it. So this is not a garden. This is out in what I call my Prairie Reimagined. And these are plants that once I stopped mowing, once I stopped grazing cattle and horses, once I stopped spraying with 2,4-D, the native seeds were still there and they started coming up. I did a burn in November of 2017. And then from then on, the native plants are slowly returning. Now, I know they won't all come back, and I am also doing a lot of planting, but I am determined before I die to leave a small bit of Prairie Reimagined. Now, other reasons that people want native plants, of course, for the birds, we call them things with wings, the birds, the butterflies, the flies, the beetles, the dragonflies there, all of the creatures that have wings and fly, they are related either by their diet or their shelter or their seeds that they use for food to our native plants. They evolve together. And then for me, number one reason, they feed insects. Now, I know it seems like anathema to have a gardener say to you, you should love insects and welcome them into your yard. And in fact, plant plants that will attract the insects. But the statistics I hear, between 3 and 6% of insects are the bad guys. And most of them are not native. They were brought here, usually accidentally. So 97 to 95% of insects are either totally positive and beneficial, or at the least, they do no harm. And they do so much good. The example I have here is one of my favorite moths. This is a moth, although it looks like a butterfly. There's a whole bunch of moths that wish they were butterflies. They have brilliant colors. They fly during the day. They drink nectar. And this is the clouded crimson moth, and it lays its eggs only on our native gaura. That's its caterpillar, which is pretty darn cute. So if you drive down Highway 68 in September, you will see these pink clouds of flowers all along the highway, and that's our native gaura. And it is an annual, it's self-seed, so I also have a special place in my heart for self-sowing annuals because I don't have to plant them. They just come back every year and then bloom for months, unlike perennials, which come back every year and usually only bloom for a week or two. So 70% of our food depends on insects. So that is a reason to care about them. Even if you don't love them, you need to be respecting and honoring them because they are a great part of your food chain. Incidentally, when we say pollinators, that's almost a code word for bees. I'm going to make up a statistic, but I'm admitting to you that I am making it up. But I bet about 90% of our pollinators here in the temperate zone are bees. And then the rest fill in. Well, bees, both honeybees and native bees are, well, the populations are collapsing for a lot of different reasons. So thank goodness we have this backup team of the moths and the flies and the ants. But all of our native systems are under great stress. Another reason to treasure insects is they are the primary food supply for birds. 97% of our terrestrial birds eat insects, and that's what they feed their babies. And then all of our smaller mammals and reptiles and amphibians, insects are their diet. Insects are like the bridge between herbivores who eat only plants and carnivores who eat meat. And all of these animals, most of these animals who eat insects are omnivores. They also eat both plants and animals. And again, they're like that bridge in the food chain. As a biologist, I honor these kind of special positions in the food chain. But the biggest difference, in my opinion, between gardening with natives versus ornamentals, it's not really the plants, it's the people. And so the kind of person who would choose to do their front yard as a Prairie Reimagined, that's a very different kind of person who would have a garden in Mission Hills and have a gardener, and it would be very groomed. Because you could make a groomed garden, I'm going to show you some, with natives. And all of you who've gone on vacation, you've seen a sprawling garden of ornamental plants. You can't, we were trying to figure out how long can you leave a garden for before Mother Nature starts to reclaim it and make a difference. And we pretty much decided, at least here in Miami County, you really can't leave for more than a week or two, and Mother Nature is back at it. So unfortunately, and this is from statistics, this is what 95% of homeowners prefer. And those of you in Johnson County, I love and respect you, but there are an awful lot of neighborhoods that's lawn, some meatballs for your foundation plantings, and then this giant house on this little itty bitty lot. And, you know, your eye becomes adjusted to that, even though it's highly unnatural. And of course, what I hope I can say categorically, for most of us master gardeners, we'd like to loosen this up a little. If you don't know this, lawns, grass, are the main ground cover, the most common ground cover in America. And that environment of lawn is, in fact, it's more sterile than the Mojave Desert. Deserts have more life than our lawns do. Well, one of the reasons a lot of people don't like the idea of gardening with native plants is because they don't like this unorganized look, although this is really a nice job. I mean, you can see that's white sage, which is an artemisia, a native artemisia, and then black-eyed Susans, and then echinacea, and then there's also some, what do you think that is? Maybe that's Bonset coming up, but you can see that it is in ribbons. It's not haphazard. It's not little plops of color. It really is. But for a lot of people, that's still too unorganized. You know, the human brain, we evolved to like organization. We're always looking for patterns. And that's why we don't like a prairie to try to call that a garden and put it in your yard. It just doesn't work. The thing is if you select natives and then maintain and groom them in the garden in the same way you do ornamental plants, they will be just as refined. And what I always tell people is if you keep your edges neat, it looks well groomed, no matter what the plants are. And I'm going to call this to your notice if you didn't notice it. There is a thistle that's dying in the background. You can see the dead leaves up its long, skinny stem. But if I didn't point that out to you, you probably wouldn't even notice because the edges are clean. And so that is a big tip for both ornamentals and natives, keeping your edges clean. The economics are with us. Dennis, does this show, can people see that last column, the cost of maintenance?
Yes, ma'am. The 3,000 versus 800. Is that what you're asking
You got
about?
it. Yes. Perfect.
Okay. I can read too.
Well, see, on my screen, I've got people on top of that last column. So there is an initial higher cost, often with natives, if you didn't already have a lot of hardscaping and edging, which you need as what we call clues to caring with native plants. So you've got that initial expense, but very quickly that is overrun by the difference in the cost and maintenance. Some of it's water, of course, some of it's maintenance, but also you're not going to have that lawn, which is just a huge guzzler of water, fertilizer, and your time. So we've addressed some definitions, some truths, some pros and cons about native plants and about how they could fit into your ornamental garden. But the aesthetics concerns remain. The species, the natives, they are not as floriferous as their nativars and other ornamental plants. They don't have the wonderful foliage in purples and burgundies and glistening gold, and they tend to be lankier, especially when they've come out of the prairie and no longer are having to compete for water and nutrients. And of course, for me, because I fully admit it, I garden for aesthetics. That is my very first and main principle for gardening. And if pollinators and birds needed something different, they would be out of luck. Fortunately, pollinators and birds and I all agree on what a garden should look like. So we are in good shape. But here would be a typical garden. This isn't mine. This has native plants in it, and this is in July when things start to get kind of droopy. I wouldn't call this drop dead gorgeous. I'm a magpie. I need color. I need sparkle. And so here's the garden that I just showed you, with and without flowers. Again, it depends on your aesthetic. Some of you may find the flowers gaudy. And incidentally, the flower in the lavender flower in the very front is our native fragrant aster. But of course, the brilliant red, that's one of my self-sowing annuals, that's celosia, or you call it coxcomb. So which garden works better for you? Well, I mean, again, your choice, but I'm going for the flowers. And pollinators need flowers. And so to me, the solution is, yes, I want my native plants, partly just out of pride of Kansas, but also for my insects. But then I also need the ornamentals for the flowers. These plants were bred to have bigger flowers and bloom longer. And so if they still have nectar and pollen, and it's as nutritious as the species, we are in good shape. So here, and I've labeled what the plants are so that you can see how you can mix together natives and ornamentals. And to me, this looks completely harmonious. And yet I've got host plants, the yellow kind of raceme looking plant, that is our native senna. And then of course you already know our coneflower, the Echinacea Papuria. Those are both host plants, and all of the rest are nectar plants. And Monarch Watch says that when you're planning your garden, you should have 7 times more nectar plants than you have host plants for your butterflies. So lots of flowers. Native plant foliage is boring. I admit it, but I also have a lot of ornamental plants that have brilliant foliage. And you see my little saying, I made this up. Flowers are ephemeral, foliage is forever. You may use that if you wish, but it is true. Your garden looks better longer with a lot of brilliant foliage than with flowers, which do not last as long. And okay, I just have to sort of blurt this out. Flowers don't last very long because their sole role is reproduction. And once they've been pollinated, then they turn to the serious business of making seeds. And you might not like to think of it this way, but flowers are the genitalia of the plants. Yes. Okay. I think I need to move to another slide. So this is one of my handouts that I give people who tour my garden. And I do tours all the time. So consider yourself welcome. You just shoot me an email. I need to have at least 4 or 5 people. I can't do one by one. I don't have time, but put together a group and we have fun. This is one of my handouts. And what I have here are plants for purple foliage, plants for silver, bright yellow, and the soft gray-green. And as I think about the plants I have in my garden, all the other plants besides, I mean, this is a pretty limited plant palette. What is that, about 8 plants? And I have lots of them repeated everywhere. All the rest of the plants have something to do with pollinators and butterflies. But the garden is gorgeous because there's all this color from the foliage. Okay, where did the Nazis go after World War II? They went to join our HOAs. Yes, I am just convinced people who were bullies on the playground they have now joined an HOA, and they like pushing people around and making rules and being really inflexible. Now, out here in Miami County, if I asked how many of you live in an HOA neighborhood, I don't think there'd be anybody, because we are still, we're pretty Wild West down here. But up there, I'm finding most of you, even in older neighborhoods, that's just houses, it's not condominiums and townhouses, are in regulated neighborhoods, and if not by an association, by your city or your county. Yikes. Well, first of all, I don't recommend going ahead and ripping out your lawn and starting to plant native plants or even ornamental beds. You don't want to immediately draw that line in the sand. So first, check and see, are there regulations? And this is a time when I'm a joiner. I like belonging to groups. But if there is a gardening club in your neighborhood, this is an excellent time to join that club, first to find out what the situation is. But then if you all need to approach City Hall or approach the Homeowners Association, you can do so as a unified group. But then if you find that there are these rules about weeds, and it's amazing to me, I mean, they define weeds, sometimes even anything over 12 inches. Oh my gosh. But find out what the regulations are and then do some communicating and educating. And as part of that, I recommend having photographs of beautiful plantings. And it also helps if it's a special garden, like a pollinator garden or a butterfly garden or a wildflower garden, and you have a sign that would demonstrate that also helps. And what I would always say to you is maintain some lawn. Do not rip out all that lawn. Now, I don't have a lawn at all. I always say the devil has a lawn, Lenora does not. But you destroy the sense of place. It's one of the reasons homeowners associations get so upset, is because your house, your yard no longer fits the look of the neighborhood. So you need to leave some lawn, especially in the very front, so that you still have that look of the place. And here's an example of a sign. Prairie Moon Nursery has several similar signs. They have one that says Prairie in Progress, but very attractive. And it lets people know that this was planned. This is not just a bunch of weeds. People who don't know plants, they won't know. They won't know that that's prairie drop seed, one of the most beautiful grasses in the world, but you have a sign to let them know, oh, well, this is special, and it can start a dialogue. What we want are clues to caring. And this is true in any garden. Gardens don't exist without a gardener. And it should be very obvious that this bunch of plants are being taken care of. And so part of that is, we call them clues to caring, but how you arrange the plants, it's not haphazard. I mean, these are native plants, but it's, it's a garden when you look at it. The plants are in rows. The plants are color coordinated. There is you see in the very front, there are the rocks that are the edging. There's also mulch that's been applied, and it meets all of the definitions of a garden. Now, this is my prairie garden. See, I have my ornamental gardens, which include natives, and then I have my prairie garden, which is all native plants, somewhat arranged, and then I have my prairie reimagined, 3 different levels of plants, and 3 different ways of taking care of each of those kinds of plant habitats. This is August. So by August, the plants have grown enough that you no longer can clearly see, although if you peer down in the right-hand corner, you can see that there are definitely rocks lining the bed. And I keep that edge absolutely pure and clean, so that it's obvious it's a garden. But inside, it starts to get a little bit chaotic. This, on the other hand, is not a garden. This is my prairie reimagined. You can see it's very haphazard, even though there are a lot of very bright colors. And this is what I hope to gradually have 7 acres look like. But in your garden, and this is part back to the garden, These are all native plants, but I treat them as though they are ornamentals. So unless you knew the plants, you would not know these are natives. And so that's the Pennisetum. Oh no, the geriatric brain just got me. Husker red, it came back. And of course, our butterfly weed, which is just glorious and very long blooming for a perennial plant. And you see the clues to caring. You see also the path is lined and there is a concrete path. I actually had concrete professional sidewalk people come in and lay down a sidewalk and then a rock wall. All of these let you know this is a garden and this is being taken care of. And that's what people care about, is that it doesn't look like an abandoned mess of weeds. And if you showed a photograph like this to a homeowners association, I think they would be more accepting. Of course, garden design is necessary anywhere that you have a garden. And I've shown you some examples of groups of plants that are not in a garden. They're in a prairie, or you might want to call it a meadow. But anything that I call a garden, well, okay, again, I have to admit my advantages in life. My mother was a landscape designer, and I mean, it was just part of my life that gardens were about function, and you express those functions through forms, and that you use color for mood. And plants were the very last thing that you consider when you're designing a garden. You figure out what you want your garden to do for you, what functions, and then what shapes are going to let those functions happen, what colors you want, what colors make you happy. And then you want to have strong colors for drama. If you like drama, you don't have to have drama, but I'm very dramatic. And then lots of repetition to give a sense of peace and unity. And once you figured out this is what you want, then what plants are going to give me this? And then you have the great fun of doing all of the research of what plants would fulfill these functions. Now, I know for some of you, and I've given up trying to convert you, I know I never will, but for some of you, your idea of planning a garden is planning what you're going to wear on your visit to the nursery, because you're just going to grab what looks pretty at the time you're at the nursery, plop it into your grocery cart, and then plop it into the ground when you get home. That's a really expensive way to garden, because we've already talked about plants know what they like, and if you've plopped them somewhere they don't like, they're not going to succeed. And of course, my other thing is, I have a reputation to uphold, and if plants are not looking good, I rip them out and they become part of the compost, because if they're not happy, I'm not happy. And of course, I don't move plants around. If plants were meant to be moved, they would have feet. And so if a plant isn't doing well, it didn't work out, the relationship failed, remove the evidence, because it was hard, and I hate to plant. And so it was bad enough having to plant it once. I am not about going to plant it again and again to get it to the right spot. What I'm going to do, sometimes I spend as much as 2 or 3 years. I've got a spot in the garden. It needs a plant. It takes me that long to do my research and study and decide exactly what should go in that spot. But not everyone gardens like I do, and that's okay. Whatever makes you happy, the important thing, it's your garden, your way. Well, I mentioned that you can have a very formal garden with native plants. And many people, especially in Johnson County, because you have some very, very formal neighborhoods. And I like formal gardens. I really do. I like that sense of order. So we have formal gardens. And then we have, oh, I'm sorry, here's another formal garden. This is switchgrass, one of our native grasses. I have one that's about 9 feet tall, and I have to put a bungee cord around him in July to keep him from flopping, but he is absolutely magnificent. Here is in a formal setting. Here is in an informal setting, and you see him, he's next to the red grass. Now, before you lose your minds wanting to know what that red grass is, that is Pennisetum fireworks. So Pennisetums are the fountain grasses, Pennisetum fireworks, and then the purple one There's two of them. That's Pennisetum Rubrum. Well, they are perennials in zone 8, which means I do have to plant these every year. And I don't understand people resisting the idea of planting a plant every year when it is this wonderful. And it's not that big. Even I, decrepit little old person, can grab that fireworks in March and rip it out of the ground and then tidy up the hole and put another one in that same hole, and we all are happy. Easy to do. So here's what, it was one of my great disappointments in life to find that there are master gardeners who do the toss salad. They just plop plants in, but it is your garden and it is your choice. And certainly you can have some beautiful color-filled panoramas of plants and flowers by plopping. I'm just not a plopper. I'm a planner. So which do you prefer? And this is another thing. When I moved to Kansas, I was just shocked to see so much mulch and to see plantings that there was more area of mulch than there were of plants. You know, if you've been to England and looked at their gardens, they don't use mulch, or most gardeners don't. They plant the plants so closely together that it shades the ground and prevents weeds from coming through. Of course, they don't have droughts like we do. You know, they've got lots of rain, and so they don't need mulch to retain the moisture in the ground. It's just a different way of doing things. And which do you prefer? Some people really do prefer this very neat and tidy, and then there to be space between each plant. Now, I like my plants touching each other. I want my plants even fondling each other, but that's personal, whichever way you like your garden to look. Instead of using plants to define your garden, landscape designers recommend that you use your hardscaping. And so again, I don't know how else to do it. Get out the piece of paper and do some drawings and draw where you're going to have your beds and your sidewalks and your paths. Of course, now we have an easy way of doing this. Highly recommend. Just Google your address and print out in black and white the map to perfect scale of your property, and then make 5, 6, 10 copies of it in black and white, and just start drawing shapes and lines and paths until you have something that pleases you. And then you can establish the beds. I always like to outline my beds, which simultaneously is outlining my paths. And I don't have to draw a new map every year of my plantings. Of course, a lot of these are perennials. A lot of them are self-sowing annuals that come up in the same spot every year. So I just have a few spots to fill in a garden design that's already established. This is, to me, really interesting. I'm debating in my mind, should I tell you her name? Probably not, because I didn't ask permission. Anyway, this is a very well-known gardener here in Kansas City, and she has a Georgian mansion in the Mission area. And this was all rose bushes. And she got the native plant bug and decided to rip out all of her ornamental plantings and put in native plants. And after the ripping out, she hired the Greensman Company. I mentioned their name because they know how to do this, to create this very formal wall that recreated the feeling of the Georgian mansion, so that when she put in the native plants, and this is our native deciduous holly, Ilex verticillata, but it looks really quite at home because it's also has that hardscaping to ground it. And incidentally, that is Pumpkin the cat. Paths are the most important part of your hardscaping, both because they are a shape, but also they give a sense of destination throughout your garden. And so when I first built my garden, I started in 1982. That's how long I've been working on this garden. It will never be done, but I don't want it to be done. I made all the paths like 3 feet wide. So the first thing I did when I retired in 2012 is I went around and ripped up every path and at least doubled, if not tripled, its width, because I hadn't done it right. And my mother would not have been proud of me. Well, she wasn't. In fact, she was quite critical when she would come and visit every year and look at my gardens. But that was okay. It was always good criticism. So wide paths, as wide as you can make them. Now, this is Mickey Lewis's garden. For those of you who know Mickey, wonderful birder, brilliant birder, and also a butterfly person. And she's in a neighborhood that is all grass. Every yard is grass, 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 grass. And her husband loves to mow. So what she did is create this very narrow, it's only about 3 feet wide, full of both native and ornamental plants, and made them as strips. And then the grass became paths. And again, if you've been to England and seen the English gardens, many of them have grass paths, and that's how they use the grass. They don't have big expanses of lawn. Instead, they have these wonderful grass paths. So you want to clearly mark the edges of paths and beds, make it really clear. And again, that idea that keeping that edge really clean is what's going to make your garden look well groomed. Other things is to add human elements. Again, clues to caring. Sometimes people will say, well, I could put another plant there, and that's true, but would that plant have the same impact? And the advantage of objects over plants is these objects are going to look the same 365 days a year, and no matter the weather or the season. And so it gives you some consistency in your garden. You want to limit your plant palette and do a lot of planting in masses and planting in repetition. I mentioned golden Alexanders once before. It is a native prairie plant, but it doesn't grow in dry prairie soil. Prairies have little areas that are called seeps, where the groundwater seeps up to the surface. And so you'll find the golden Alexanders in these little wet spots. So I put my golden Alexander, it's only about 20 feet from the hose outlet, the spigot. So I can keep it watered. But I also have to keep an eye on it because it is one of our thugs. And I am going to have to deadhead every single one of those flowers. Excuse me. It's a member of the carrot family. And so it's like dill and fennel, where they self-seed like crazy. Now, a member of the carrot family, who is going to eat a golden Alexander leaf? That would be a black swallowtail. But here, and in fact, when people want to do native plants only gardens, and so they need something to feed the black swallowtail caterpillars, this is what they plant. But in my garden, I have my golden Alexander over here, but in another area, I have my fennels and my dills and my Queen Anne's lace and my parsleys. Guess where the caterpillars are? Over on the ornamental plants, not the native plant. They haven't read the book that they're supposed to prefer natives because they don't. So people are always asking, should I use seeds or plants to start natives? And on the surface, seeds seem more economical, but I have a friend, Dennis knows her, but I won't mention names, who bought $500 worth of native plant seeds in a collection. You know, they came in a big box, all these seeds. And she, bless her heart, and I'm so jealous, she has a true prairie remnant, but didn't have that many flowers because, you know, it was a true prairie remnant. And she wanted lots of eye candy. So she threw out in her prairie remnant, which I would say was probably no more than 3 acres, all these seeds. Guess how many germinated and came up? 0. And that's pretty typical. It's so much better, so much more economical. oh, I hate to mention this, but it's so true. You need to first kill all of the plants that are there if you're trying to start a prairie, or if you're starting to put some natives into your ornamental garden, you need to clear the space where you're going to plant them, because baby native plants do not compete well with established plants. So plants turn out to be much more economical and much easier, much less frustrating. If you like starting seeds, I view starting seeds as similar to root canal. I have no interest, but for those of you who enjoy it, there's lots of resources, and a lot of our native seeds need to be striated, which means they need cold treatment. Some of them need freeze thaw, freeze thaw, freeze thaw, 3 or 4, even 5 times before they germinate. That's not my idea of a good time. But if you set it up so that they're going through all of this torture outdoors, and then you have a plant in spring to put wherever you need, well, talking about all that is beyond the scope of what we want to do tonight. What I like are self-sowing annuals. I have tons of them that are ornamentals, like cosmos and balsam and celosia. Well, there are lots of native plants that are also self-sowing annuals. It's so interesting. I had a tour of people through my garden, and one of the gentlemen was looking around and remarked how interesting it was that native plants were all perennials and none of them were annuals. And he was standing right next to one of my snow on the mountains, which is a self-sowing annual euphorbia. So I was able to immediately point that out to him. It's not economical for nurseries to sell annuals, and they don't like selling self-sowing annuals at all, because then you're only going to buy from them once, because you only need to buy and plant that plant once, and from then on they spread their own seeds. There you see my goatweed again. I love that plant. Partridge pea, black-eyed Susans, burr marigolds are a kind of sunflower, snow on the mountain. All these plants were in my yard, and I just kind of built the gardens around them, because why waste a good thing? This is Alan Branhagen's garden here in Missouri. Of course, now he's in Minnesota, and already has an absolutely glorious native plant garden, which this is. And what you see is it is beautifully groomed and maintained. You see all the signs of caring, like the grass paths and then the concrete path. I don't see any weeds. Do you? Even one weed just so demotes the beauty of a garden. So it is the elephant in the room whenever we talk about gardening, is weeding. And it is what most gardeners hate the most. If they list the things they don't like about gardening, it's going to be weeding. Now I, of course, toilet trained far too early, love weeding. I love that detail. And it's part of why self-sowing annuals work for me, because you do have to weed rather than plant. They have a tendency to, plant themselves in paths and edges and places you don't want them. But one of the things I like to consider when we're talking about using native plants in any garden, any setting, but especially in ornamental gardens, is, well, how are they managed in the wild? What did Mother Nature do? That is, whenever I have a problem in my garden, I do sit back at WWMND, what would Mother Nature do? And I have solved a lot of problems by just observing my garden, thinking about how Mother Nature does it. And it's really how I developed my style of gardening, was more by observing, thinking, and becoming a plant. Much more than reading, even though, I'm very pedantic and I love to read, but observing works. So how does Mother Nature manage plants? She's got a lot of tools, and I've used some of them. Well, of course, I used burning and grazing, and then whether a plant is in the sun or shade has a lot to do with how it grows and what it is. And then moisture and competition. And Mother Nature isn't planting plants. Plants are selecting where they want to grow. So in general, healthy plants have chosen their spot. It's another reason I like to leave plants where they are, because they've chosen their spot. And so they're much more likely to be successful than if Lenora has chosen a spot for them. So for humans, we really only have 2 ways to manage and maintain our yards, our landscapes. And that's either mowing or mulching. And I'm going to be honest, the easiest way to manage land is to plant grass, or out here, we just start mowing what's ever on the ground and it becomes grass because all of the other plants eventually can't compete. And so either mowing or mulching. I am going to side on mulching. And so if you keep your paths groomed and then inside the garden, you keep it mulched, it will look like an ornamental garden, no matter what plant you've got. You're going to treat the plants like ornamental plants. They will look like ornamental plants, maybe not immediately, but pretty soon. So mulching in place. I do not have a compost pile except for kitchen waste. Everything in the yard. I mean, to me, it seems really foolish to pick everything up, drag it off to a compost pile, wait a year or two, because I'm too busy to turn it, but eventually it'll be dirt, but then gather it up and drag it back to the garden. I leave everything in the garden. And I also have come to believe that if you remove even a leaf from the system, you are removing nutrients from the system. I have not fertilized my yard, my gardens, in 35 years. I feed them by mulching, and then the mulch becomes compost and becomes soil, and all the little microorganisms who are loved, they are the ones who feed my plants. So some people have trouble imagining this, and so I'm very specific here. You know, if you deadhead, throw the deadheads underneath the plant. If you prune, throw those little clippings underneath the plant. As much as possible, whatever plant was growing there, when it dies, you put it right back down where it was. Because if it's a perennial, it's going to come back. If it's a self-sowing annual, it's going to come back. If it's a new plant, well, then you already have microorganisms and nutrients in the soil waiting for it. The very best nutrition for any plant is last year's body. The same plant that grew there last year is going to have all the nutrients that plant needed in its little body. So don't take them away. Just leave them right there in the system. One little caveat there: if the weed has seeds on it, in my world, you would get it weeded before it goes to seed. If it had seeds on it, depending on your method of dealing with trash, I have a burn barrel. You probably have to bag it up and send it away, but never, never, never let any seeds, weed seeds, stay in your garden, because that just makes the problem worse. Often as much as 10,000-fold worse, because there are weeds that have that many seeds. So you have choices for mulch. Now my garden is self-mulching. I don't have to buy mulch because I have now enough trees and mature plants and debris. I really do not need to buy mulch, and I can mulch all of my beds 2 to 4 inches deep with just the plant material that is there in the fall. But I used to have to buy mulch, you know, when my garden was really new and I didn't have a lot of plant material. And, you know, I planted my oak trees as sticks in 1981. Of course, they're now about 60 feet tall and I have lots of leaves. I used to get leaves from the neighbors. Chopped leaves are absolutely the very best as a mulch. And then any debris, I just break it up with my hands. And I measured my hand. My hand is 3.5 inches across. And so when I break up anything to be mulched, you know, whether it's ornamental grass fronds or twigs, stems, by using my hands, all of my mulch is broken up to about 3.5 inches. So it's very homogeneous. It doesn't look wild and woolly. And of course, I've crushed up the leaves a little. I do have a wonderful leaf chopper kind of machine. Now, part of it is I've turned into a Luddite in my old age, and I really try to avoid machines because I want to do everything by hand. I want to be touching my grasses and I want to be touching my leaves. But the problem with the machine is it grinds up the leaves too fine. And then when you put them on the surface, they form a mat, which prevents water from trickling through. And that's also true if you use wood chips, is they form a mat, the fungus unites all of the pieces of wood chips, and it's an almost impenetrable mat that water cannot get through. Plus, they compete with the plants for nitrogen. Plus, they degrade so slowly that they don't feed your plants. So again, you see here my list, and all of these are available from your own property. I have friends who have arranged with all of their neighbors that they will pick up their leaves. They are not going to go out to Missouri landfill and be made into compost there. They're going to happen right there in the neighborhood. Many of the hardware stores sell really nice quality straw, wonderful mulch, no seeds in it. The problem for me is the color, and you have to break it up pretty fine for it to look, to me, aesthetic. But what you can do, and what I did it back in the beginning, is buy straw, put it down, and then on the very top put a layer of crushed leaves and debris, and then gradually I didn't need straw anymore. I had enough of my own. Cotton burr, well, now mostly you can only find cotton burr compost, and compost and mulch are not the same thing. And easy to tell, one look, and I know whether or not I'm looking at mulch or compost. If you look at mulch and look at that picture there, you can see little twigs and pieces. That's mulch. Compost, you cannot identify what it's made of, and it looks like soil. It's fine, it's homogeneous, while you'll still see what it was in its former life if it's mulch. And then underneath the surface of the mulch, it's gradually breaking down into compost, and then into a soil that the microbes are busily munching away on and feeding your plants. I get complaints all the time from people about my mulch went away. I had all this mulch on my garden in April and May, and now the mulch is gone. And they're really pretty unhappy about it because they're going to have to put more mulch. Well, where did that mulch go? That mulch was eaten by the microbes and fed to your plants. It's a great success when the mulch disappears. It lets you know that you have got the nitrogen cycle working in your garden. I'm not going to read you my list here of all the reasons you shouldn't be using synthetic fertilizers. It's just bad stuff. What can I say? You're poisoning the soil, you're poisoning the microbes. And what it does is it shuts down the nitrogen cycle that naturally happens between the bacteria and your plants. Your plants and the bacteria have a symbiotic relationship, and your plants are actually the ones in charge. Let me go to a prettier slide. Your plants are the ones in charge of the relationship because they have what the microbes want. Plants photosynthesize and make carbon, and they have it in long and short-term chains, and the bacteria need that carbon. The one thing that plants can't do for themselves is take nitrogen out of the air, and they need nitrogen to make amino acids, which are made into proteins. So they sort of have this relationship with the microbes where they bribe the microbes into grabbing nitrogen and feeding it to them by trading for carbon. And understanding that soil health and that nitrogen chain, and you don't even need to know all the details of the chemistry, but it helps you to understand why healthy soil is the most important part of gardening. And having mulch on top of your soil, to me, seeing naked soil is like seeing anyone's naked body. It's not pretty. I want all soil to be covered with a nice blanket of mulch. There is a conflict here, I admit, because 70% of our native bees do make their burrows in the soil, and they need uncovered soil. So I have lots of wild areas on my property, and so I comfort myself that that's where my native bees are making all of their homes. Plus, I have a digger bee colony, native bees, under my porch. I have about 500,000 digger bees living under my porch. Everyone else in the United States would have killed them. I absolutely adore them. So I am also making up for having mulch in my beds by giving a home to my digger bees. I'm going to repeat again, even more strongly, do not use wood chips as mulch in your flower beds. No plant evolved with wood chips as their mulch. Plants evolved with dead leaves and sticks and twigs and stems as their mulch. And that's what you want to recreate. What does Mother Nature do? She uses leaves and stems and sticks to mulch her plants. So it's almost time for me to go out and start scrunching up all the leaves and twigs. And so when I do that, for instance, here are my Helleborus. Some years they have bloomed as early as the last week in January. I've got buds. I don't yet have flowers, but if you don't have Helleborus, highly recommend them. And they do have nectar for the bees. I see honeybees on them sometimes as early as first week of March. So people are like, well, if you're putting all of this mulch, and one of the reasons for mulch is to suppress weeds, how can your self-sowing annuals and other plants get through? Well, this is where you can be in control. So there's a picture first of my stalks unshredded and then shredded, so it looks nice and tidy and homogeneous. But then where I want plants to come up, most self-sowing plants need the sun to germinate. And so I uncover, I push aside and make even thicker the mulch on either side. And I design the ribbons and the shapes that I want and the places where I want plants to come up. And so by mid-April, in this particular place, I will have Mexican zinnias self-sowing and coming up to be at the edge of the bed, which you can tell by the rocks. And so I do an especially serious mulching at the edges of my beds so that plants don't grow out over into the path. So I would say that mulch is like the magic solution to gardening problems. There are very few issues that mulch cannot fix. Well, there's my list. So some final thoughts. First of all, is the plant an ornamental or a native? I see that as an artificial distinction. And until we had tissue culture and grafting and GMO, all plants were native somewhere. Excuse me, the troll has attacked. Oh, sorry. But, it's not really the plant. It's the gardener. And where you put the plant and how you manage the plant is how the plant looks. And so we tend to associate wild and weedy with native, but I promise all of us have seen wild and weedy ornamental plants too. It's all in how you manage it. And anytime you have a garden, it must be managed and groomed. So some resources for you, if you hadn't seen it yet, excuse me. Alan has put together a beautiful book of natives that adapt well to a garden. He suggests using only natives, but they mix well with ornamentals. I'm also very fond of Dave Tyler's book. He talks a lot about the animals. Excuse me. I'll recover, I promise. He talks a lot about the animals that use your garden and the importance of natives to those animals. And so gives you a lot of good information on the why. And then if you aren't familiar with National Wildlife Federation, they've been around forever. Wonderful resources. I get their bi-monthly magazine, excellent information. One of the things I put down that they just published a new PDF with suggestions on how to, for them it's wildlife especially, for me it's natives and insects, but we end up at the same place. We want more flexibility from an HOA, and so a whole list of ideas of how to proceed if you right now have a very rigid HOA who will not let you have natives or even flowers in your front yard. Also, another organization, if you're not familiar with them, Xerxes Society for Invertebrate Conservation. If you're interested in bees, that is really their specialty, but they even do clams and slugs. I mean, If you're an invertebrate, they love you. Wonderful organization. They have lots and lots of resources. And as you saw on the previous slide here too, they also have signs that you can get. You can go through their certification process and then buy signs. Again, it's creating that teachable moment when people see your sign and ask about it and know this is not just a bunch of weeds. This is a very special garden, a very special place. Kansas Native Plant Society, information about our native plants. We have about 2,000 native plants here in Kansas. On the Missouri side, but you know, state line is a very artificial line made by man, not by Mother Nature. And so these resources work on either side of the state line. And Grow Native is also just a wonderful program full of resources. The book for understanding the relationship between plants and animals, Bringing Nature Home by Douglas Tallamy. Hopefully you've had a chance to hear him. We had him last year, didn't you? Had him as one of our speakers last year, Dennis. Truly inspirational man. And he was the first step in changing how I garden when I read his book. He's such a good writer. It's like reading a novel. It's just wonderful. And then where to find native plants. That used to be a huge problem. When I decided I needed spice bush so I could have spice bush swallowtail, it was before the internet, and it took me about 5 years to finally find a nursery in Wisconsin who sold spice bushes. Now it's like 2 clicks of the mouse and you have found the source of the plant. I am always a great fan of Missouri Wildflower Nursery. They're in Jeff City. I've never been there. I just order by mail. The native plants I have, and again, 70% of my biomass, the native plants that I have, if they didn't arrive on their own on my property, I probably purchased them from Missouri Wildflower Nursery. But now many of our organizations have plant sales. And many of us specialize in native plants, because if you go to Suburban, and let me give Suburban some credit here, I don't mean to trash them. They tried. Most of the nurseries about 5 years ago, you know, native plants, native plants, native plants. All the people were asking for them. So they bought native plants, and it's a huge investment to buy plants, and nobody bought them. And so a lot of the traditional nurseries have kind of given up on native plants. But in the meantime, specialty nurseries and groups like our Master Gardeners, our sales always have lots of native plants, and the Audubon Society, Burroughs group, they, you know, you will see more and more native plant sales. And so I just happened to have a slide about our sale, just happened to have. We're always the last weekend of April, and last year, because of COVID, we moved it ahead 1 week, but we're back to our regular weekend. And we try to have as many species as possible, but also lots of nativars. We'll have at least 50 different species of butterfly host plants. No other sale truly specializes in butterfly host plants like we do. And you'll see we are operating 3 days, and there will be no sales before that 9 a.m. opening. I know people love to, butterfly people especially, they're criminals. They'd arrive as early as 7 o'clock and swarm our sale and take all the plants before we even open. That's not going to happen anymore. 9 o'clock, we mean it. I think that's my last slide. It is. Okay, I'm going to leave my slides up here in case somebody has a question that we need to return to one. But Dennis, I think I'm ready for questions.
Okay, I am ready to go. So if you are going to seed some natives in your garden, what time of the year would you be doing that?
What time of the year does Mother Nature plant that particular plant? When does it go to seed? And that's how you know when you should plant that plant. So all these people are saving seeds through the winter that Mother Nature threw on her seed head in August or September. No, that's when that plant should be planted in your garden.
Yeah, I kind of answered, I kind of agree. I agree with you. I kind of also said, you know, when in doubt, kind of that April month, because a lot of our natives are warm season plants. So they may not start germinating until then, but you're right. They go through the freeze thaw cycles, those type of things.
April's a terrible time for a native plant.
Well, which leads to the next
Sorry.
question. The
Okay.
the seeding in the milk jug kind of thing. Do you
Yeah.
recommend that for natives? The milk jugs, you know what I'm talking about? This milk jug.
Sure,
seeding?
absolutely. Yes.
And can you go real briefly? I know we're running out of time. Real briefly on how that works, because I know you got a whole presentation on that, I believe.
Yes. Well, actually, it's the kind of thing that all you have to Google is seeding in milk jugs. And initially, I wouldn't have them in the milk jugs because you want them to be exposed to this cycle of freeze thaw, freeze thaw. Now, you can Google and look up, and there are charts that say which plants do not need that freeze thaw cycle. But most perennial natives do, because think about it. For the last couple million years, they've been living out in the prairie, and it's been freeze thaw for their whole life. So that's what they are evolved to do.
So these kind of all lead one to the other. I'm kind of putting them that way together.
You put them in order. That's good.
Someone asked the question, you recommended all these self-sowing annuals in your garden, but since most nursery garden centers don't sell the self-sowers, how do you get your start on self-sowing annuals or self-seeding?
There are a couple of wonderful companies. The one I use, to Select Seeds. They specialize in heirloom plants. And so everything they also now sell plants, but all of their seeds are open pollinated heirloom plants. You only have to buy that seed packet once. And from then on, the plants will take care of themselves.
Okay.
There's another company I'm trying to think, and I'm sure somebody out there knows it. It's in Decorah, Iowa. And I'm just,
Seed Savers Exchange.
That's it. That's it. Yes. Yeah, that's the other one. Seed Savers
and probably Baker Creek down in Missouri probably also would have some of those.
Yes.
Poppies in the garden. What species, varieties, do you have any poppies in your garden?
Oh, I have gazillions of poppies in my garden, and bees do like them. You remember Bernard Armstrong? Mm-hmm. And he was a hoarder. And one of the things he hoarded was he probably had at least 50 packets of poppy seeds. So I got a pail out and dumped all of those seeds in the pail. Now, here's the secret to poppies if you don't know it. You wait until it snows. Well, first of all, the ground where you're going to plant them should be smooth. It should be no mulch. It should be exposed. And then you wait for snow, and then you spread those poppy seeds and spread them very thinly, because every one of them is going to germinate. So I have no idea what all of my poppies are. All I know is they're absolutely fabulous, and they come up every year. Because once you've got them established, each poppy makes gazillions of seeds. And so there's enough seeds that you will get reseeding. If you try to do that reseeding yourself with that $5 packet of seeds that only has 100 seeds in it, you're probably not going to be successful.
Yeah, Lenore, I can't tell you the variety either, but the one that most people grow are the big pink. There's a red, there's a salmon, there's also
those are the opium poppies, and I do have lots of opium poppies.
They are, especially the lavender ones. But yeah, you can still grow them in your garden and enjoy them. But I don't think they're sold under opium poppies in the trade, though.
Well, but if you know the botanical name, the botanical name is Papaver somniferum, which means sleep. Yeah, you can tell. The nice thing about this method too, having lots of different kinds of poppies, if you don't know this, are very promiscuous. And so they're constantly crossing and forming new hybrids. And so you don't know, now to me, this is a plus. You don't know every year what size, color, whether they're doubles, triples, whether they're fringed, because they've all been having promiscuous sex and crossing with each other. It's wonderful.
On your prairie, do you burn? And then if you do burn, are there people out there that help you burn? You do it yourself? Of course, there's all sorts of rules and regulations you need to follow too about contacting fire department, those type of things.
I belong to the, I'm trying to get the words right. It's the Kansas Prescribed Burn Association. And you have to join and be a member in order for them you have to be part of the burn. I mean, you got to be working, and to belong and be burned, you have to also participate in 2 other members' burns. So it isn't like you can hire someone to come do it. And all the time we find people who are not capable of participating in burns. They would love to hire us. By law, we can't. We don't have the insurance coverage. We don't have the personnel. But that's how I got my burn done. I did the first one in 2017, and I'll do the next one this probably September. And here's another thing. You know, they talk about the Flint Hills managed to be a prairie, but they burn in April. They're not burning to be a prairie. They're burning for grass for the livestock. If you want to burn to have native plants in your prairie, you burn in late summer, early fall, not in March and April.
I think the rest of them I kind of answered online. They were kind of more specific, some interesting questions. So, the resource books, Alan Branhagen was one, and the Dave, I didn't
Tylka.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah, that was that question. There you go.
Back here. There he is.
Yeah,
native landscaping for.
Yeah, we can leave that up for a second. If you got your camera handy, your phone handy, just snap a picture of it and you've got it. Okay.
But there's so many books and resources out there. And like I Googled native plants on the extension website. There were hundreds and hundreds of articles. There's no shortage of information. The shortage is time and then brain power to process it all and know how to make it happen in your own garden.
Was that the Kansas Association of Controlled Burns?
No, ours is the Eastern Kansas. We are one of the members of the Kansas Association. We're the Eastern Kansas Prescribed Burn Association. I'm secretary.
Eastern Kansas Prescribed Burn Association. If you Google that, will that pop up then probably?
Yes, but we're only active in Miami and Lynn counties. We don't do Johnson County. Johnson County needs to form their own. Now, I know the Johnson County Parks and Recreations does burn, but I think they only do them on county land.
Yeah, and they've been burning here the last few weeks or so. There are some prescribed rules in Kansas when you can burn those type of things.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, I think go back to your plant sale slide now, because there's a lot of confusion on the dates of your plant sale.
On what of my plant sale?
This one right here. Stop here.
Yeah, I did.
Yeah, so here again, snap with your camera, and we will post the recording. I'll post that site one more time in here where the handout and the recording would be for those. Because I posted it right at the very start of the meeting. So there I posted again, so you can copy and paste, but give us till maybe the end of the week. The handout's already there, but for the recording, give us to the end of the week. And I'm going to stop recording. I forgot about that.
Okay. And if I could say, Kansas City Gardener,